Hello my fiery friends, the Infernoman here with the hottest in budget deck technology. And for today's deck tech, join me once again as we continue to make our way through the Basically series. For those that don't know, this is a series of decks I put together that will not require you to utilize a single rare or mythic to build.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off.
That's right, so we'll continue to make our 100 card Brawl decks, and this time we're going to be doing a mono blue deck, a deck that I put together that is called Basically Cynette. But before we continue, if you do like any of the content that I do, please like, follow, and subscribe wherever you watch the content. You can support me monthly for a small amount on Patreon, where I have all of my extended bonus footage posted. We also have a Redbubble spot where you can buy merch like stickers and shirts, or for free, all you can just do also is just join our growing community on Discord. Your support helps keep this channel going. All links are in the details below. Longtime viewers of the channel know how we do it. We have to talk about the stats of the deck before we dive right in. So basically, Cynette, as I just mentioned, is going to be a mono blue deck with an average mana curve of about 2.1. You're looking at a total of 33 creatures in the deck. We'll be rocking 14 instants, 6 sorceries, 7 artifacts, 8 enchantments, and 36 lands. Our mono blue budget deck today is going to be a mid-range pile that is hopefully going to try to throw our opponent off balance as much as we can. We're talking about utilizing a handful of counter spells, some bounce effects, and any kind of tempo play that can either tap down creatures or just mostly get them off the field, so we should have no problem closing out the game. Once we are close to the end, we can bring in our commander to hopefully just get a little extra pump and hopefully smash our way in the sky to victory. But you may be asking yourself right now, is it possible to pull off such a cheap and effective strategy on a budget that doesn't use any rares or mythics?
Well, you got me.
In order to understand how our deck works, let's actually talk about our commander first before we go completely into our deck itself. So we're going to start off course with Cynette Jelly Drover. Cynette here is a 4-mana 2/2 legendary creature human wizard. When Cynette enters or when she dies, you create a 1/1 blue jellyfish creature token with flying. Creatures you control with flying get +1/+1. So, as you can kind of read from the card, she's not exactly the strongest commander we've ever played with, but she still has a very easy to understand game plan once she hits the battlefield. Our deck is going to be broken up into 3 separate categories, each of them of course indicating what we want to do with this deck. Primarily it's going to be all creatures with all flying abilities, or at least as many as we can, and then of course we'll then talk about all of the general tempo plays that we want to do with our deck, and finally general support that helps us ensure that our game plan will go off no matter what. So, starting in the 1-drop slot with our creatures here, we'll have Symmetry Sage, Human Wizard 0/3, technically it is also a 0/2 if you're playing this in paper, but either way, with the Magecraft ability, gives one of our other creatures pump as long as we cast an instant or sorcery. We'll also utilize here Cloudfin Raptor here. This 0/1 has the Evolve ability, meaning that if we get a creature in with a bigger power or toughness, it get a +1/+1 counter on it to make it a little bit stronger as the game progresses. Fairy Seer pretty much enters as a flying creature and it helps us scry 2 to fix our next draws. Harrier Strix here can dap down a target permanent, and then for 3 mana we can just loot by drawing a card and discarding a card. Merfolk Wind Robber here, when it enters and starts dealing some combat damage, we get to mill at least 1 card. However, later on we can sacrifice it and draw a card if an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. Siren Storm Tamer here, another excellent cheap little card here, do some early game damage, and you can sacrifice it later on to counter a target spell or ability an opponent has to target a creature we control. Spectral Sailor here also kind of has the same thing and more or less as Harrier Strix. You can bring it in and help us draw some cards, a little more expensive, but a lot more effective as the game progresses. And finally in the 1-drop slot, Spyglass Siren here, when it enters, create a map token, which you can utilize later on to sacrifice and explore as you need to at sorcery speed. In the 2-drop slot, we'll use Cerulean Drake here. It has flying and protection from red, which is sometimes a little bit helpful for us, but realistically you want this to sacrifice to counter a target spell that targets us. We'll utilize also Diversion Unit here, another card that we can sacrifice later on as a 2/1 flyer here, but however you can use this to counter an instant or sorcery unless if our opponent pays 3. Embercold's Messenger here allows us, of course, to then create some extra Eldrazi spawns as long as we draw at least a second turn each turn. We'll also utilize Fairy Duelist here. When it enters, you can give a targeted creature an opponent controls -2/-0 until end of turn, so it's a great little tempo play for us to weaken something. Fairy Vandal here is also another flash flyer. When we draw our second card each turn, we get a +1/+1 counter to make the Fairy Vandal a little bit bigger as the game progresses. Fear of Isolation here is also good. Although we do have to bounce back a permanent to our hand, sometimes we actually do want to do that to get a little bit of extra value out of any one of our creatures, and it's a decent 2/3 flyer for 2 mana. Malakar's Watcher here is going to be a 1/1, however when it does die, we can simply just draw a card, so a great chump blocking to help trigger any one of our other abilities. Mischievous Mystic here, when we draw our second card, we create a 1/1 flying fairy creature token to help us again just go wide with our game plan. Nightveil Sprite, when this creature attacks, we can then Surveil 1 to help again filter our next draw. Plumecrete Escort here is going to be one of our protection creatures. It has flash and flying. When it enters, give one of our creatures hexproof until end of turn. Sky Theater Strix here will get a little bit bigger with a +1/+0 pump until end of turn as long as we cast a non-creature spell. Hypnotic Strike is actually really sweet for our deck. It's a 2-in-1. On the adventure side, you can counter a target spell with a mana value of 3 or less, or it's simply just a 2/1 flyer. And Ornithopter of Paradise rounds out the 2-drop slot here. It's going to be one of our few mana rocks, although it also is a creature, so it's a great mana dork for us at any point in the game. And then going into the 3, 4, and 5-drop slots, we'll have Cloudfin Seer here, creature that simply enters and helps us draw a card. Hope Ender Coatl here is an Eldrazi snake, has Devoid, and it has Flash, so this is great for us when it enters to counter a target spell an opponent controls unless if they pay 1. Hydroelectric Specimen here is one of our few creatures that actually doesn't have flying, but it's a really good valuable card with the Flash ability. As it enters, you can then change the target of a target instant or sorcery spell to a single card target to this creature. If that sounds a little bit on the confusing side here, simply put, this just helps us kind of redirect something away from something we don't want to get hit with, or it can otherwise be just a land in a pinch. Moonfork Puzzle Maker here, when this creature becomes tapped, simply scry 1 to again just help fix our next draw. Tome Raider is just similar to Cloudkin Seer here, simply enters and draws a card. Warden of Evil Isles here, creature spells with flying we cast will cost 1 less to cast. We don't have too many high-end creatures that have flying, but this helps us of course cheapen our cost and make sure we are a lot more efficient with our game plan. Murmuring Mystic rounds out now the 4-drop slot here. Anytime we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we also get to go wide by creating a 1/1 blue Bird Illusion creature token. Tide Skimmer here allows us to help draw some more cards here. Anytime we attack with 2 or more flyers, just draw a card. Mulldrifter here, another great classic card here. With the evoke ability, you can cast it for 3 and it instantly sacrifices itself, or pay the full cost, and either way, when it enters, draw 2 cards. Umara Wizard is another one of our creatures that technically doesn't have flying unless we cast an instant or sorcery. Then it can be a flyer at least until end of turn, or it can be a tap land. Windstorm Drake here is another one of our great cards here where it gives all of our creatures with flying +1/+0. And then rounding out the last of our creatures, technically it is actually an artifact vehicle, but it can be a creature if it wants to be. When this vehicle enters, draw 2 cards or crew it for 3 to make it an artifact creature. Now covering the disruption and tempo plays here, starting at the very top here, Ether Spellbomb. This simple little artifact allows us to either sacrifice itself to draw a card, or we can then return a target creature to its owner's hand. It can either be ours, or it can be one of our opponents. Dispel here is one of our many counter spells in the deck where we can use this to counter at instant speed, 1 instant spell. Enter the Enigma here makes one of our creatures unblockable and simply just draw a card. Fading Hope here can then bounce back a creature to its owner's hand, and if the mana value is 3 or less, scry 1. Into the Flood mod does the exact same thing as Fading Hope. However, if we gift a card to an opponent, we can also bounce back at instant speed for only 1 mana, a non-land permanent instead of a creature. Phantom Interference here technically is actually more expensive than being a 1-drop here. If you cast it for the spree cost, of course, for 2 mana, you can either make it a counter spell unless if our opponent pays 2, or for 4 mana total, you can make a 2/2 white spirit creature token with flying. Rapid Hybridization is actually one of the rare but awesome removal spells blue gets, so we can destroy a target creature and then we can turn it into a frog lizard for our opponent. If we really want to protect our whole game plan here, we can also utilize here Slip Out the Back, put a +1/+1 counter on one of our creatures, and have it phase out. This is extremely valuable against maybe certain opponents out there that like to try to do mass exile against our game plan. Wash Away here is probably one of the most dirtiest ways we can counterspell an opponent here. For 1 mana, you can counterspell an opponent's card if it wasn't cast from their hand, or for the cleave cost of 3 mana, it's just a general counterspell overall. Witness Protection here is going to be great because for some of the creatures we don't want to bounce back, destroy, or whatever, we can then utilize this to turn it into a legitimate business person.
My name is Guy Incognito.
I.e. it becomes a 1/1 white citizen creature token that loses all abilities. You See the Guard Approach here is also one of my most favorite of all cards here because you can use this to tap down a creature, or you can give one of our creatures hexproof until end of turn. Bayeen Veil here can either be a tap land if we need it to be, or give all of our opponent's creatures -2/-0, which can be great for us to kind of turn the tide and weaken up or soften up their blows against us. Lofty Denial is one of our best counter spells here. Counter a target spell unless our opponent plays 1. However, since we have a lot of flyers in the deck, they have to pay 4 if they want to counter the spell. Negate here just helps us counter general non-creature spell of any kind. High Speed Hover Bike here is actually also good for us because when this vehicle enters, tap down 1 target creature and also has flash, flying, and a crew cost of 1. Raven Form here, also another one of our rare removal spells that actually is in blue here, where we can exile an artifact or a creature and we leave behind for our opponent a 1/1 bluebird creature token of flying. You can also foretell it for 1. Dissipate here, one of our more expensive counter spells, but it's actually great for us because we realistically want this because we not only counter the spell, but we can also exile it away from the game. Refute here is also one of our other last counter spells here. We can counter a spell and then allow ourselves to draw a card and discard a card. And then finally, to round out our package of support here will be Sink into Stupor. It can either be a land if we need it to be, or just use it to simply return a target spell or non-land permanent an opponent controls to their hand. Rounding out the rest of our support package here, starting in the 1-drop slot, we'll also use Aquarius Form here, a 1-mana aura. Once we attach this to a creature we control, it becomes unblockable, and anytime our creature attacks, we allow ourselves to scry 1 to help fix our next draw. Combat Research here, along with Curious Obsession here, are going to be great cards because both of them kind of do the same thing. Anytime we deal combat damage to a player, we can simply draw a card. With Combat Research, however, if we attach this to a legendary creature, it gets +1/+1 and Ward 1 for a little bit of light protection.
Neat!
Curious Obsession, however, actually does need to make sure that our creature does attack. If our creature doesn't attack, and also, by the way, it actually doesn't have to be the creature we attach this to, but if we don't attack, we, however, will lose the aura, so be aware of that when you use the card. Circling back over, we also have Consider, Surveil 1, and simply draw a card. Mentor's Guidance here is going to be a sorcery speed. When we cast a spell, we can also copy it to make 2 versions of it, or we can scry 1 with each one and draw a card, as long as we of course have at least 1 cleric, druid, shaman, warlock, or wizard. Thankfully, Cynette is a wizard, so this is great for our deck. Chart, of course, as long as we attack this turn, we can draw 2 cards. Otherwise, we have to discard at least 1 card. Favorable Winds is great for our deck because with the majority of our creatures being flying, we'll get another extra +1/+1 pump on top of, say, Cynette's, which is great for us to make powerful flyers. Riddle Form here, if we cast a non-creature spell for this enchantment, it can then turn into a 3/3 Sphinx with flying in addition to its other types. If we don't do that, we can simply just pay 3 at any given time to simply scry 1 to ensure we get what we want our next draw. The Modern Age here is going to be a card which is in a saga. We can draw a card and then discard a card for the first 2 parts, and on part 3, transform it into a 2/3 flyer that's a spirit as well. For extra card draw, we'll also utilize Winged Words here. Costs 1 less to cast, so we can actually cast this for 2 mana to draw 2 cards. And finally, to round out our package here, our one and only mana rock, Heraldic Banner. If we name blue, of course, all of our creatures will get an extra +1/+0 pump, and of course tap this mana rock to add 1 mana of the chosen color. As far as your mana base is concerned, it is going to be as simple as we can be. We are an ultra budget deck, so we're going to be maintaining 31 islands, 1 Lonely Sandbar, so we can use this for cycling if we need to later in the game, 1 Mystic Sanctuary, since we're mostly going to be running all islands. If this enters untapped, we can then put an instant or sorcery from our graveyard back on top of our library for more value. We'll have an Amonkhet Race right here. If we start our engines and get this to max speed, then we can utilize this to give one of our creatures haste until end of turn. Arid Archway here, we will have to bounce back one of our islands, but if we do, this could be pseudo ramp for us later on in the game. And to round out our final part of the package here, Demolition Field. Sacrifice land as always to destroy a non-basic land an opponent controls. They get out 1 land, and then we will get out 1 land for ourselves. Alright, now that we've already gone through the entire deck right there in whole, let's explain to you again how we can get the most value out of this deck and how we play it. In the early part of the game, you're definitely going to want to throw down a couple of your early game flyers and just start getting a little bit of damage here and there. The increments will add up very quickly if your opponent does not have answers for them. If you're anticipating that your opponent is going to start casting their more bigger, more effective spells, you might want to start holding up a couple of extra islands just to get ready some tempo plays. Your counter spells, your bounce effects will definitely make your opponent feel sad, especially if they have to tap out just to cast 1 or 2 things. By the midpoint of the game, you should hopefully have just enough flyers out where once you can get Cynette on board, you'll then be able to get a nice little pump and then start really speeding up the clock against your opponent. Even if you're unable to keep Cynette on the board, as you've seen already, we have quite a few different ways of pumping up our extra creatures so we can do a little bit of extra damage. One of the trickiest parts about this deck is just knowing what to counter, when to counter it, and then what type of counter to actually use. Sounds confusing?
Huh?
Well, it doesn't have to be. Just again, look over what your board state is and anticipate what you might need in the moment. Knowing which counterspell to use can mean the difference between having a dead card in hand or just having the key card that can completely turn around a board state against your opponent. This in itself leads us to one of the biggest advantages our deck has. Since we are all in on flying creatures, we can do a lot of early game damage before your opponent has an answer to us. This in itself means that we can just keep poking away at our opponent until we're ready to put down that Heraldic Banner, or maybe get our Windstorm Drake or even Cynette down, and eventually, once we get that extra pump in, we should be able to close out the game within a single turn or 2 to then get our victory. Our next biggest advantage with the deck is we're a very reactionary deck, and I know that sounds a little funky to say, but hear me out for a second here. What I mean by this is we actually don't have to throw out everything onto the battlefield immediately and be hyper aggressive, unless if you know for sure your opponent is very slow. And with that leads us of course to the third and mostly the biggest advantage that we have with the deck, and I'm just going to be blunt with you. We're mono blue. Any opponent that you face off against playing as mono blue means that they know for sure you will have counterspells in hand, and they should be right to fear that. Once they see what we're going to try to do, that means we have the psychological advantage, which again may not be something you're going to see too often in digital format, but your opponent knows at some point they are going to get counterspelled, they're going to get something bounced away, or they're going to get out-tempoed by us at any given moment. So, as an example, say like you get a couple of creatures out and you're ready to now put Cynette out to then close out the game within the next turn or so. By doing that, and as long as you can have a couple islands out, your opponent knows that they're going to be in a bad spot where they're going to have to then wrath or risk losing the game. Also, with that psychological advantage, this sometimes can allow you to kind of get a couple of little extra hits in, or sometimes cast a couple of extra spells that sometimes you may not have any business trying to do. But this of course means that we're getting into our opponent's head where they're going to have to anticipate, do they have that counterspell with 2 islands open? Or maybe that 1 island might not be something so bad, or maybe I can cast a creature and get away with it since we know that they cannot counterspell with the mana they have. But they might not realize that we might actually have that advantage ready to go, or we can just bluff our way to hopefully getting a couple of cheesy victories along the way. But of course this means we have to talk about the weaknesses now to the deck. So, being mono blue, here's what you're going to have to anticipate. First off, while we can be a very evasive deck, we unfortunately are not a very strong deck, at least not in the early part of the game, and we also have to rely a lot on those support pieces to give our flyers a lot more power. So, to elaborate with that, while we know we can do a lot of flying damage to our opponent's face, until we can get down at Heraldic Banner or until Cynette can come down, your creatures can only do so much until your opponents might end up having stronger defenses or sometimes just enough spells to then keep removing our key pieces that prevent us from getting the final points of damage or enough pump to close out the game. The other major weakness to our deck is, while we are mono blue, and I did mention earlier we are very much in the reactive style of gameplay, that does mean that your opponent can sometimes get around some of the stuff that they know we already have in hand. Most often than not, your opponent already knows that we're going to have counter spells, but sometimes your opponents don't care about those counter spells and they're just going to keep throwing stuff down because they may be aware that we only have so many counter spells and we only have so many options to remove or bounce things away until your opponent eventually can outvalue our game plan. And the other major weakness to our deck is anything that involves making spells uncounterable versus what we're trying to throw at them will also make us feel very sad. While there aren't that many decks out there that are going to focus completely on being uncounterable, just a couple of key spells or a couple of key creatures may prevent sometimes our game plan from going off because they could just keep outvaluing us and keep preventing our counter spells from doing anything. Now, with all that said, if you still like what Cynette was trying to pull off today on a budget, as always, I will show you on screen right now a couple of quick little screenshots of previous deck techs we have done with mono blue or variations of this style of archetype over the course of this channel. If you haven't already noticed, those links have been scattered throughout the course of this video, so please be sure to click on one of those if you're interested in seeing what else blue can do for you. And with that all out of the way, here are my final thoughts that I want to give you on this deck. Well, as I mentioned earlier in the video, Cynette Jelly Drover is not the strongest commander we've ever played with, even on mono blue. You have to admit that even with the simplicity of this deck, she's actually a very effective commander once you manage to have a good board state, and she provides just enough support to help us get to our victory. So, to put it another way, if you're a fan of token go-wide strategies, if you're a fan of playing with evasive flying creatures, and if you're a fan of the type of strategy that doesn't really focus too much on your commander, but rather focuses on the whole of the deck, then I would definitely say, give this deck a try, and I assure you, when you manage to make a giant flying army of creature tokens, you're going to have a lot of fun doing so, and you'll be very surprised at how you can pull it off on today's budget, and when you manage to out-tempo your opponent, you will definitely not be disappointed. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching, everyone. And just remember that no matter what you do play in the game of life, always be sure to burn bright. Later.